Hello, good evening. Welcome everyone to Kinrossche Climate Cafe with a special focus on Loch Leven tonight. It's so nice to see you all here. It's my great pleasure to introduce to you Dr. Linda May, the leader of scientific leader from Center of Ecology and Hydrology. Dr. Linda May spent over 40 years researching our Loch Leven, its water ecology, also studying the impact of surrounding areas and land management, how it affects Loch, and also looking at climate change effect on the water quality. Tonight she's going to present a talk about Loch Leven, recent algal blooms on Loch Leven, and possibly suggesting what might be the reason, although I'm not sure it's very clear yet. Firstly, Dr. Linda May is going to talk about her science bit, and then her assistant Gemma, I forgot your surname. Ash. And Gemma is going to introduce to you a new app that studies and registers Loch algal bloom, and it's a new way of researching its development. Thank you very much. Enjoy the talk.
So you're all very welcome. Yes, okay, I do quite a lot of work, but I'm at home here. So I'm not Dr. Linda May, I'm just Linda. And I'm going to talk to you about what's been my life's work in a way, working on Loch Leven. I started working on Loch Leven, took my first sample there on the 4th of October 1976, and I'm still working on Loch Leven. And you'd think we'd know everything by now, but you know, things change and we don't know everything, and this is what I'm going to talk to you about today. So I want to take you back first to a little bit before I started in 1905, and this is the first real records of water quality that we have from Loch Leven, collected by Murray and Puller, these two amazing gentlemen, who took out this amazing piece of equipment here. Hang on, it'd be better if I had the pointer, which was made out of a piece of piano wire, a weight, and a bicycle wheel, and they clamped it on the side of a rowing boat, and they went out and they depth sounded more than 200 lochs in Scotland. And now we have all the fancy equipment to do a similar thing, and they were absolutely spot on with their measurements, which is really quite impressive. So they published a series of books here which are well worth a look at. They're beautifully leather bound. I happen to have a copy of them, which is really nice. But you can actually go to the Scottish Museum website, and you can actually read everything there. It's all been scanned now, so it's available to everybody to look at. Look, this is the bathymetric map, the depth map that they created of Loch Leven, which is very similar to the one that was all repeated in 1968, came out to the same answer. But I think they used not rowing boats, but actually used engines that time. So one of the things we know is that Loch Leven was really quite clear at that time, and a value that's been documented from that time is that the underwater plants were growing at 4.5 meters depth. And they can't do that if the sunlight can't get to the bottom of the loch and light the area that they live in. And so what we do see over time, and you'll see in a moment, is that as the water's got greener over the years, then less light has gone down and the underwater plants don't grow in such deep water. But I'll not tell you all the story now, we'll move on to the next slide. So this is back in 1968 when we took our first samples as an institute, part of an international biological program that was funded across the world, and Loch Leven was actually apparently twinned with Lake George in Africa for that project, but I wasn't around doing this sort of thing quite then, so I don't know too much about that. This is us now. You can see the difference. We no longer wear the yellow oil skins and the old equipment. We now have fancy equipment, lots of electronic equipment to measure things. So things have changed over the years, as you can probably imagine. But we still go out in all weathers. I prefer not to go unless the sun's shining, but other people go out in the ice and the snow and everything. So we make sure that we get data all the year round. So I'll just run through the sorts of data we collect. So we collect a massive amount of data. We've been doing it since 1968, so we've been collecting data every two weeks at least, and in the early days every week. Since 1968, that's 55 years of data. That gives us a really nice overview of how the loch behaves when things change, as we'll see. So we measure all sorts of things. We measure the physics, well, that includes the temperature and the water clarity and these sorts of things. We measure a lot of the chemistry, so we measure nitrogen, phosphorus and silica because that's what makes different types of algae grow, and the algae feed the food chain. And we measure quite a lot of biological variables, so we look at the algae or phytoplankton, we look at the zooplankton, which are the little water fleas and things you've probably seen in the water that eat the algae. We look at the underwater plants, we call them macrophytes because that means big plants, which differentiates them from algae, which are little plants. Benthic invertebrates, that's these sorts of things that go around the bottom of the loch and recycle all the dead things. And I don't know if you ever come to Discovery Day, but we always put on a display of, we take some samples from the loch and we take some microscopes. So if you want to see them all live and crawling around, come to the next Discovery Day because we'll be there with our sample showing you what lives in the loch. These, of course, are the sorts of things that the fish need to feed on, so they need to be there. The other thing we've done over the years is in 1985, 1995, 2005 and then 2015 is that we've looked at the amount of nutrients coming into the loch from the catchment because that determines what the water quality is like in the longer term. In 2025 we do another survey, and for those surveys we get on our bicycles and we cycle around the loch and we take a sample from every inlet once a week. The funding isn't agreed for the 2025 survey, but I think at the minute it's really quite important that we do that, and I think you'll see why in a moment. Lots of other people collect data, and we all share the data to make sure that we have a really good understanding of the loch. So Kinross Estates have very kindly been measuring weather data every day since 1968. We have really long-term data sets that go back hundreds of years, and that's because lochs have a memory in the bottom of the loch, the way that things settle, the sediments. It tells you how the loch was in 100 years ago, 300 years ago, and we can compare that to the present day. So I'm not going to go through all these, but we have fish catches since 1900 on a daily basis, angler numbers, tourist numbers, visitor numbers, various bits of regulatory monitoring that's done by SEPA as well as ourselves. And we also have water supply data. So when they built the sluices in 1850, which you probably know about, and changed the level of the loch, since then they've collected the outflow data, how much water is going out of the loch every day since 1850. That's a massive data set that you can use to look at climate change impacts, for example. And we'll come back to why that's quite important in a minute. So, it's not just a piece of water. Underneath it is all these things grow and feed on each other. And what you'll see here is, down at the bottom here, what we call abiotic resources. So that's non-biological resources. Things like light, carbon dioxide, nutrients, and things like that feed in at the bottom end. You'll notice here that they go to phytoplankton. Phytoplankton are algae. But they're good algae. There are lots and lots of good algae. Not the ones you're seeing at the minute, but most of the time there are a lot of good algae which feed into this food web and support the fish and support the aquatic birds and also all of these things that crawl around at the bottom and also the underwater plants. It's a massive ecosystem. We generally, last time I counted, we collect data on 250 different species of plants and animals in the loch every 2 weeks. So it's a very, very complicated system, and it's all delicately balanced, and then what happens if something pushes something the wrong way, it all kind of falls apart and tries to readjust itself, and unfortunately that's what it's trying to do at the minute. So these are good algae. We see those in Loch Leven. They're very tiny. but you'll need a microscope. But these are really good algae, and this is what we have at the moment. We have an enormous amount of this one, Asterianella, which is a diatom. That's really good because it feeds the food chain without doing any damage. And the reason we know it's there, apart from that I looked under the microscope and checked, the reason we know it's there is because the water's very brown. I don't know if you've noticed at the minute, but it's looking quite brown. And that's because these sorts of algae live in little glass boxes that they make out of silica from the water. And those glass boxes make it look a little bit brown when there's a lot of them in the water. They are not a problem compared to the ones that we don't really like, which we'll talk about in a moment. So these are the ones that we don't really like, which we had. These are my images from last summer. And they look up, and they're really quite beautiful under the microscope. This one I think looks as if it's had a bad hair day. This one looks like a necklace. They really are quite pretty, but when they get together en masse, then they cause these massive algal blooms that we've been seeing. And these are some of the algal blooms from last year, which I'm sure you've seen some of them. And the problem being that this one and this one in particular, when it's really, really still, like it is now, it used to be incredibly windy here, but not so much now. They just float to the top because they have little bubbles in them that make them float to the top. But they shade everything else out. And big scums you see around the edge, you just get a little puff of wind and it takes all these algae and plonks them the place you don't want to see them, which is on the beach, which of course is a problem. And the best thing in the long term is to get rid of them. In the short term is to be really, really careful because under really high levels of cyanobacteria, as we call them, blue-green algae, that's not really an algal, it's a photosynthesizing bacteria. They, when they start to die back, they produce really nasty toxins. And you've probably seen the signs up. You should keep away from the water when these algae are there because they're neurotoxin, nerve toxins and liver toxins. And where they accumulate around the edge in the scums, they can be really quite dangerous if you touch them or if you drink the water, or let your dog into the water. You've probably seen all this in the newspapers. So unfortunately, we do have a little problem here at Loch Leven with these types of algae at the minute. But it's not just here. This problem is right across Europe. And I have a sense of information from Lake Balaton, which is in Hungary, just the other day. Exactly the same problem. Lake Windermere, you've probably seen in the newspapers the same problem. So what that tells us is that the thing that's making the change isn't just at Loch Leven. It's all over Europe. And it's likely to be climate related. So we'll come back to that in a moment. So people keep saying to me, I've never seen Loch Leven so green. It's never had algal blooms before. So I just want to show you this one. This was in 1992. So on the 6th of June 1992, we had a massive algal bloom, which we lovingly call Scum Saturday when we're talking about it. It was on a Saturday. There were going to be all sorts of water sports there. Scottish Natural Heritage, as they were then, Nature Scot now, had organised this, and it all had to be cancelled because two things. We had nasty algal scums, and the wind blew it all into the harbour. So if the wind blows it the other way, people tend not to notice it so much. But algal blooms are not new. Somebody has asked me when was the first one that was recorded, and I don't know. I know that in the 60s, when we'll see some data in a minute, these problems were already there. So back in the 90s, I very, very distinctly remember this news headline, "Toxic bloom turns loch into shallow grave." And of course that's really extreme, but you're still seeing these sorts of messages to do with Windermere at the moment, and not so much here, because I think we're a little bit more careful what we say. What happened when this headline came out was the bloom lasted about a month and it disappeared. The reputational damage lasted 30 years. And so we need to understand, but we also need to be careful what we say because it really impacts the local community. We measured the loss of income just to the local community around the loch just in the 3 months that followed that. And it was £1 million in 1992 and obviously quite a bit more in present day values. The fishery never really recovered because people just didn't come. They didn't come to the hotels and so on. So we have to think about, whilst we've got the problem, what we tell people about it and the sorts of headlines we put into the newspapers. So what we discovered was, looking at our data up until the 1980s, was that there was a very close relationship between the amount of algae in the loch and the amount of phosphorus in the loch, and I'm sure you've heard quite a lot about that recently. So the first thing we did in 1985, was we went around everywhere and measured what was coming in from all the different inflows for the loch. So this is the amount of algae in the lake, how green it is, and this is the amount of phosphorus in the lake. And this is from 1964 to 1984, the data we collected then. You can see that there was quite a strong relationship between the two. But it's interesting to note that the very early data were much, much worse because there were no water fleas in the loch eating the algae. So the amount of algae built up much more. And the reason for that were pesticides, moth proofers coming from the willow mill had killed all the daphnia around about 1954. They came back in 1972, and everything changed completely then. And so it's really very important that we understand what's going on when we try and change things, because it isn't always what we think it is. So building on that, we then reduce the amount of phosphorus, and I'll just run you through 10-year steps. So we reduced the amount between 85 and 94, and both the phosphorus fell and the amount of algae in the loch fell. Then 1995 to 2004, then we got less phosphorus and less chlorophyll again, less algae again. So we were moving down this curve. This black triangle, this black diamond here, is the water quality target that we set ourselves to try and achieve. When we come later, 2005 to 2015, you can see we're getting really close to this black dot. And then 2015 to 2022, we're pretty much at the target. But the problem is that in the last few years, we're going back up again. Now, the first thing is we're not going up to where we were. We've moved up a little bit. And the question is, why has the phosphorus gone up? Why have the algae gone up? And that's what I'm going to talk to you about. In the meantime, we've been wondering, what about the nitrogen? This must have an effect as well. And what we've seen is that when the loch started to recover quite quickly, around about 2007, we noticed that the amount of nitrogen in the water had dropped, the nitrate. And that's important because underwater plants, which stabilise the system, they don't like nitrate above 1 milligram a litre. And so we suddenly saw all the plants coming back. And that is also another factor that's affected what's going on. So, by 2012, we managed to get somebody to publish a very positive message in the newspapers. It took us 5 years to get that. But it was really important to let people know that things had improved. That's me doing some field work, which I don't do so much now. Okay, so the underwater plants, you can see 1990, 1993, they were in fairly shallow water because the water was quite green and full of algae. As it cleaned up, they moved into deeper and deeper water. By 2014, we'd actually got them into as deeper water as they were in 1905 when Murray and Puller measured where the plants were. So we were pretty pleased with that, all of us, the whole catchment. And we knew this had an impact on the birds. We know there's lots and lots of geese come to Loch Leven. We hear them flying over sometimes. But there's lots of other fish-eating birds and other breeding ducks and things like that. And it's very famous. It's got every international badge for birds that it could possibly have, I think, with conservation value. But when we were looking at our data, what we found was it was very interesting that the pochard, which are also Loch Leven, it's a dabbling duck, and if we look at for Scotland, what happened to the pochard in Scotland from 68 to really almost to 2000, they're slowly declining. At Loch Leven, they were following the trend for Scotland until the underwater plants started to re-establish, which is what they feed on, where they live, and then they started to go up. And so we can see that having cleaner water quality and the right ecology in the loch actually benefits other biota, plants and animals, the birds, the fish, and so on. The fish community, right the way through, have done pretty well, apart from, I remember distinctly back in 1992, I think it was, there was a fish kill where the nasty algae that we had then, they all rotted, and there was a deoxygenation event and there were dead fish floating around the harbour. I don't think we've seen that, I haven't seen that for a long, long time. I don't think we've seen that, unless anybody knows differently. We haven't had that since the 90s. The fish do very, very well in Loch Leven, and we don't see any problem with that. These are the main fish that we have at the minute: eel, brown trout, perch, pike, and three spine stickleback. We don't have all that many eel at the minute, but the rest are doing very well. Okay, so now we come to the return of the algal bloom and exactly what's caused that. Now we don't know for certain. Well, what we can see from the graph here, the green lines are the algae, the cyanobacteria, the nasty algae that produce toxins. Orange is the water temperature, and blue is the phosphorus concentration in the water. And what you can see is that in 2016-17 it was very much like it had been for years. And then suddenly we started to get high phosphorus levels, temperatures going above this 17-degree line here in the summer, and quite big algal blooms. And this one, 2022, that's the one you saw this year, which was really not good. It seems to be related to this threshold of going above 17 degrees, but that's really just an indicator of climate change, because to get above 17 degrees, you would have no wind, you would have beautiful sunshine, you probably wouldn't have very much rain. And so we know that when we get those sorts of conditions, we're getting a big release of phosphorus into the water, and the algae start to look like that. And that's what's been happening in the last 3 or 4 years. The release of phosphorus into water, we'll have a look at the. So basically that's making the concentrations go up, and we just have a look at why that possibly is. So we know that, we see it in the newspapers, we see it in the Kinross newsletter, that a lot of people think it's to do with the housing. And it could partly be to do with the new houses and so on, but when you look at the data, someone borrowed my data, I've lent it to them, and they plotted the amount of phosphorus in Loch Leven from very early on until recently against Kinross population, and said, well, that's it. It's all these extra people that are making phosphorus go up in Loch Leven. But you have to be really, really careful how you interpret these data, because another way of looking at it, or not, there we go, is to plot these dots. The summer ones, the orange ones are the summer ones, and the blue ones are the winter ones. So what you can see there is that phosphorus is going up in the summer, but it's not going up in the winter. So it's very unlikely that it's to do with the amount of housing and people and sewage in the catchment, because we're not in the type of catchment where everybody comes in the summer and they all go away. You know, those houses are still there. So we have to be really careful how we interpret these data. Doesn't mean that houses and sewage don't bring some phosphorus in, the same as the land, but we have to be very careful how we interpret the data. So there was something in the Kinross newsletter that I picked up, which I'm just going to talk you through this. There was something that said, well, we're adding phosphate to drinking water, to water supply, and that's going through the sewage works and straight into Loch Leven, so that's a big problem. So I took the numbers, and there's about 8,000 people connected to the water supply, connected to the sewage works. Every person uses about 165 litres a day. If you're putting in 1.2 milligram per litre of phosphate, and that is to stop the lead from the lead pipes getting into the water, which isn't really very good for people. And you assume a 90% removal of the treatment works, which is roughly what would happen under normal circumstances. You're putting in 58 kilograms of phosphorus a year. That's 58 kilograms of phosphorus a year when the total going in is 10,500. So it's not a massive amount. And we need to be careful how we interpret these figures. There's quite a lot coming in from the South Creek. The South Creek is really a very big catchment, so it's not surprising. And what I haven't done, and I should have, was divided it by the area of the catchment. But we do know that there's a lot coming in from the South Creek, which, although apart from a storm overflow, and we measured above that in any case, doesn't have a sewage works in it. We have the Camel Burn, that doesn't have one in it. Powell Burn doesn't. Drain 1 is the one that goes across the golf course, which has hit the newspapers just recently. That does have a sewage works. But there's not much goes in it. It's just that there's no water in it, so it doesn't dilute. And so we get quite high concentration values, whilst the amount actually going into the loch is not enormous. So we just, there's obviously some that goes in from geese. They bring in, they go out and feed in the catchment, and they come and sit on the loch, and well, you know what they do on the loch, and they bring in nutrients that way. So there are a lot of direct rainfall brings in a little bit as well. So if we look at, I wanted to compare the 2005 data that we had with the 2015 now, what to say. We're not looking into the future at the moment. What we can see here, that there are only 2 of the inflows that actually increased the amount of phosphorus into the loch compared to 2005. This is the 1-to-1 line, so if they sat there, they would be exactly the same, and below that means that there's less. And these are both inflows that don't have sewage works on them. So it's not as simple as just pointing a finger at the sewage works. It's about understanding the whole picture. So we did at one point, with the permission of the farmer, we took what we call a sediment fence, and we put it down in the corner of the field, and it lets the water through and it retains the sediment. Now this sediment is full of phosphorus. It's soil that's full of phosphorus. And this is what accumulated at the bottom of that field in about 6 weeks, in October when it rained. So all soil loss carries phosphorus around the catchment. Some of it gets into the stream, some of it doesn't. But these are the sorts of things perhaps that we maybe should look at into the future, is reducing these sorts of problems. So I just go back to my alternative explanation, which is that the phosphorus that's causing the problem right at the moment is coming up the sediments. It's to do with climate change, it's to do with less mixing, it's to do with phosphorus coming up the sediments. And here, I don't know whether you've seen this in the Kinross newsletter, but this is the difference in the temperature of the loch between 1968 and 1977 in the blue, and 2008-2017 in the red. And that is a massive increase in temperature. And you see it a little bit less in midsummer. It's mainly here and here, which tends to control the water quality. So that's something that we need to think about as well. We can't cool the loch down, we can't stop climate change. So we have to start thinking, what else can we do? And that's a contract that I've just won from the Scottish Government, is to start looking for the whole of Scotland. What can we do to stop all of our lochs in Scotland going green under climate change, because we're not going to be able to switch at all. So this is that graph in the Kinross newsletter. I expect some of you have seen that. We occasionally put things in the newsletter. I'm trying to get something in with the story that I'm telling today to get that in for next month, just so that people can see what our data shows. But there's other things. So cyanobacteria, these nasty ones that create the toxins, what they really like is stagnant water that doesn't move very much. And so we call that the flushing rate. How fast does Loch Leven flush? And as you might imagine, this last summer, it stopped raining around about April, didn't it? And it didn't rain until September. So the flushing rate dropped enormously. So what we see here is this is what we call the flushing rate, is the number of loch volumes per year that the water comes in and moves through the loch. And so what we had here was the rain stopped here pretty much. It hardly rained until here. And as it stopped and the flushing rate fell, the amount of blue-green algae just rocketed up. There's nothing flushing it through, there's nothing mixing it. And so in 2022, my money is on the fact that it didn't rain so much, for the main reason that this happened. But what can we do about it? Well, something that's in my head, and I've discussed a little bit with other people, is that maybe we could manage the sluice gates slightly differently, because they're managed the way that they were decided to manage them in 1850. And we've moved on from 1850. Perhaps there's a better way for the climate problems that we have and for the algal bloom problems now. And it's just a thought, but I have done some very simple modelling just to see what might happen. So what we found was that so the black line here, that's the normal algal bloom, the baseline data. And then we ran through the model different scenarios for flushing. Sometimes we started it early, day 160. Sometimes we started it at day 120. Sometimes we only flushed it a little bit. Sometimes we flushed it for longer, and so on. And we made this big matrix here of what the impact was on the size of the algal bloom here. And what we found that was, through the middle here, we could reduce the maximum algal bloom by about 40% by managing the flushing rate a little bit different, by manipulating the sluices in the model. Now, we've not tested this, and of course everybody knows that models are okay, but they don't have everything in them. So I would quite like to look at that a little bit more closely as one of the options for managing the one. And then final few slides. There are some handouts over there. We published this advice and guidance on blue-green algae. It's not specific to Loch Leven, it's for anywhere in Scotland. Well, actually, it's across the UK. It's used just to advise people that until we can get this problem under control, it's best to be cautious. I was up at Loch Leven last year, I think it was, sitting on the side of Loch Leven. We have a monitoring bar in Loch Leven that had broken away, so we'll get it fixed. And I thought I'll just stay up here and wait until it's fixed. And I sat there. People were coming along, standing beside the warning signs and encouraging their children to pick the algal blooms up and throw them at each other as a game. That's not a good idea. It really isn't. So it's really important that people get the message that while we have this problem, you need to be cautious. And we'll all do everything we can to solve the problem, but at the minute it's not entirely clear exactly what needs to be done. So there's this handout over there, and you can also get it from our website. We also have, which my colleague here, Gemma, will be telling you about in a moment, an algal app that you can download onto your mobile phone. And if you see what you think is an algal bloom in Loch Leven or anywhere across the UK, you can log it so that people know are aware of it, that there's a problem, so that we can see how fast this problem's spreading, because it isn't just Leven. And there's also some postcards there with these QR codes on for those who like QR codes that you can get to the websites with. And so managing Loch Leven, these are my thoughts really for managing Loch Leven for the future, but based on the data that we've collected and what we know about how locks work. We need some coordinated, everybody getting involved in this, evidence-based management. We don't need the alarmist news headlines that we see here and elsewhere across the UK when these things happen. We need a better understanding of how climate change is making lochs more sensitive to nutrient inputs. So the amount of nutrients that used to go in and be fine are not fine now. And we need to understand a lot more about that. We need to understand what to do about it. And that's the grant I've got from Scottish Government at the minute. The project starts this month and runs over the summer to start looking at what the options are. And we need to share the lessons that we learn, and we need to look at the lessons that other people learn. Other lochs around lakes around the world have exactly the same problems. And we are sharing. Loch Leven's very famous right across the world for the restoration that we did before and the fact that it's got a bit wrong at the minute. And everybody else is having the same problems, and that helps to be able to share what we know about the data and how things work. So what we've done is, just before, I think it was last week, 22nd on World Water Day, 22nd of March, we launched this portal, the Institute launched this portal. This portal has a lot of tabs on it, which Gemma's going to show you in a moment, because we wanted to share the scientific data, because it's actually valuable to other people other than scientists to understand what's happening, to be able to have a look and see what's changed, what's happened in the past, because the past is really important too. So we have the portal, we've got a bit of information about it, some data. We're going to try and keep some news articles on there when things happen or when we have major discoveries, which would be nice. We're going to put them on there. Some resources for schools and odds and ends and things like that, which Gemma's going to show you in a moment. And just to emphasise that Loch Leven is part of the global lakes family, shall we call it. It's not the only one with this problem at the minute. A lot of people are working on it. But there was a big call for World Water Day for people to start providing research funding and restoration funding for lochs and lakes across the world, including Loch Leven, and we're trying to get it in there as a case study, as you might imagine, to try and solve these problems under the climate change that we're now seeing. So these are probably not even all people who provided us with data and help and funding and all sorts of things over the years. So I just want to say thank you to those. These are my group. You will see, you probably won't see me very often up here, but everyone else comes out and takes their turn collecting samples. So if you see them in the boat on a Tuesday, every alternate Tuesday, you can ask them a few questions.
Hi everybody, thanks for having me. I'm Gemma Nash, I'm a web developer. I work for the Water Resources section of UK CEH. I've been doing it for about 5 years now. I've been involved in building this, but I'm also responsible for the National River Flow Archive website, which is all of the data for hundreds of years for that CEH has collected from the various monitoring agencies and various portals for different projects that we've been involved in, including some international work, all based around water. And this is the latest in the line of all of the stuff that's been going off. We literally released it like a fortnight ago, and the idea is to share as much information about the loch as possible as a case study of the quality and value of keeping all of this data running all the time, so that we've got this evidence base to share with everybody and to help inform what we should do in the future. So this is the home page. As I'm going to have to turn the back to you, sorry folks. The mouse does not work. So on the home page is a little bit of information about the overall about the loch, and then there's a load of tabs here so you can easily navigate to the pages you're interested in. And they're replicated along the top. So The About page goes into a bit more detail about why it's important, what's been monitored, what kind of pressures are on the environment, and what the management responses have been for these various different pressures, and what has been done in terms of environmental discovery. Our long-term monitoring page is the latest data, much like what Linda was showing you, describes what we measure, how we measure it, why we measure it, and then there's a map that shows you where we sample. So Rebower is sort of just below the Castle Island, and then at the outflow, you can turn the catchment on. She says, "Don't film me now." But these are all interactive plots, so you can see for every week that we've sampled what the value was. You can turn on and off the different years so that you can zoom in on what you're really interested in. These plots are all interactive, so you can zoom right in and look at what year, what time of the year different things are happening. And there are several determinants that we've measured, so you can look at TP, TSP, SRP, chlorophyll, which is the big one, the nasty algal blooms. You can again see in 2019 it really shot up. So you can really have a good look at the data we've collected. So our news page looks enormous. Oh, in 2022, we released Daphnia data for the 2021. Tells you all about water quality, weather conditions, all that sort of business. A really valuable data set for, that sounded terrible, for just generally, it's a really good indicator of the water quality. We were featured in BBC Landward, again, discussing algal bloom. And there's some algal torch data, which is measured by, fill me in, the fisheries. And this is another map, so you can see where these measuring points are. And again, there's another interactive map that shows you the secchi depth, that's the water clarity, the water temperature, and the different kinds of chlorophyll. And again, you can see this is the latest data. It really shot up in early summer again. Then the resources for schools, this is data, these are information sheets for students, which is linked to the national curriculum, so that students can do field-based studies, and comes with some information for teachers so that you can go out and really get some valuable learning. What else have we got? So further information about different measurements. So this is a page all about algal blooms, again, going into further detail, what causes them, much of what Linda's described already. Why were they there historically? So diffuse sources, like Linda was saying, from different places. The septic tanks being a tiny part of the problem. The water treatment work's also not really contributing. And then more recently, what's happening in regards to the climate change, and we can see the different temperatures in the loch, so how it's all going up and up and up. Sorry. Calm down, Gemma. I'm not very good at this, I do apologise. Information about greenhouse gases, and our links into the GHG Aqua project, which is another CEH project that's all about measuring greenhouse gases from flux towers, and there's a new one that's been added on St. Surfs. Yeah, macroinvertebrates, so the teeny things that Len was talking about, nice beastie that you can see that was taken out of the loch. Everybody loves a beastie. Just again, another indicator of how the loch's doing. Stuff about zooplankton, so small animals that live in the water, and then another video that just gives you an idea of the sort of thing that's in the loch, teeny tiny little beasties. Found in the loch. And again, we've got another interactive graph. This one is about Daphnia, which again, a really good indicator of the water quality, how well it's doing. And you can see it's going down. I'm sure Linda can explain why. And And then, so that's the last page. Apart from the glossary, we just started collecting some information put together for people so that they can drill down into some of the jargon. And then the last thing that I'll quickly talk about.
Can you just say, Gemma?
Sorry.
So it's not finished.
Yeah, it's a work in progress.
We're going to be adding lots and lots of extra stuff to it, but we thought it was at a stage where it was starting to be useful. And we'll make sure that the data is available to download. Some of it isn't at the minute, but it's quite a big job. But we're making progress.
Yeah.
Okay.
We'd really like your feedback as well. That would be great. Right, so moving on, the Blooming Algae app that we described earlier on, you can download it for both Android and iOS, so for your Apple phone. It's really easy to use. All you do is you find your location, it does it, your GPS on your phone. You take a picture, you go, I'm pretty certain that's an algal bloom, it's green, it smells bad. This is what I was doing, I was walking my dog and I saw it and I was really concerned, I didn't want my dog to go in the water. Take a picture, send it in, we verify it, we check whether it is likely to be or not, and then all of that data gets published, both within the app and on this website. So you can see here is the last year's data. If I zoom into our area, I'm sure there's plenty of reports up here. Yeah, quite a lot of verified reports of blooming algae. You can click on each of the markers and it will give you the pictures. That's a very green, definitely blooming algae, that one. So it'll tell you how many have been correct, how many have been plausible, highly encourage you to download it, keep reporting anytime you see one, so that we can get a really good record of what's going on in the area, because we really do rely on citizen scientists to help us improve our data collection. So yeah, I'll leave it there. Thank you very much.